Welcome back to the channel. Chris Morrison, Gulf Style Ministries, back again with Tim Nichols, as always. I'd love to have you here, sir. And so we're not doing Hebrews today, actually. But you and I were talking, was it maybe yesterday, the day before? And you had said, actually, we need to have a conversation, record something else. So what's on your mind, Tim?
Okay, well, this comes out of a discussion on Facebook that in one of the sort of evergreen topics in the theology groups is the content of saving faith. And for those who are just joining us and have no idea what I'm talking about, God bless you. Turn it off now. This is your chance.
That's right. Oh, that's such a good way to put that.
But if you're still here, and I know you are because we all would have eaten that fruit.
That's right.
Then
there's an argument I didn't know about. Let me find out more.
Right. The question, the content of saving faith question, and this goes back a very, very long way. In fact, one of the better sort of treatments of the idea is in Gordon Clark's book, Faith and Saving Faith, where he talks about what we mean by saving faith and points out that if what we mean is that this person has believed a certain message, a certain set of facts or propositions about Jesus and what he did for us and what that means for me, like whatever that is, if it is a set of things that one believes, then the question immediately that comes on the heels of that is, okay, what's in the box?
Yeah. What are those things that I have to believe? Right.
What are those things? And Clark sets the tone for all future discussions in his late chapters in that book by admitting with some embarrassment that as you look at biblical passages, it seems that there's a number of possibilities. Right. Because there's not a single, set of three statements that every evangelistic encounter in the Bible, like those three things show up and that's what it is. It's not that simple. And you have to do a lot of like, okay, so this guy seems to have believed this, and this guy seems to have believed this. And, and then there's a great temptation to pick your three statements or seven statements or whatever it is. I suggest 3 or 7. That's a good Christian numbers.
Right.
Don't numbers, be doing like 6. Don't do that. But however many there are, once you have picked them and decided these are your favorites, these are the ones, then there's a great temptation to look at the counterexamples, the passage where one of those statements doesn't show up, right, and be like, well, he must have already known,
right?
Which is a marvelous tool with which you can wash away any counterexample. Right. It's great to steal from Bertrand Russell. It has many advantages. They're the same as the advantages of theft over honest toil. Right. So that's and because of that struggle with the actual data of Scripture, there's a big, periodically there will erupt a controversy over exactly what is the minimum necessary content, which is, for reasons we'll get to, a stupid question. But
it's been a huge debate now in our circles for what? How long? Going on 20
coming
years
up on
now.
20 years here. Close to 20 years, if not 20 years. But I'm being uncharitable. It's a good question. It's the obvious next question given that position on faith. Yeah. It's just that upon reflection, it turns out to be a deeply stupid question that takes you really bad places. Right. So if you're, a man under the age of 25 watching this and you're wondering why all the old guys are like, oh, here we go. When you ask this question, there's a reason.
Right. No, especially, and I went to the younger guys thing is if you're watching this and, we've talked on Discord or some of the YouTube channels out there, where these kind of conversations are happening. I don't have to say the names because you guys out there in the world, if you're in that world, I'm talking about, some people are really, really passionate about this question and they're anathematizing other people. Oh, well, you have a different content of saving faith than I do, and therefore you must not believe the gospel. And this is
we go straight to Galatians. If anyone preaches any other gospel.
Yep. Yeah. I just was in that conversation with somebody on Facebook last week. And it was just like, wow, really, really. I mean, I've been doing this for 20 years. Really, you're going to tell me that that I don't believe the gospel? It's like, it's just wow.
Okay, so real quick before we dive into the meat here, let me ask you, because they're like that all kind of hangs together. There's some curb appeal on that one, right?
Sure.
If I have decided the gospel, saving faith is faith in a saving proposition, Gordon Clark's classic definition, and
Right.
this is the saving proposition, and you are saying no, it's something else. Don't you have a different gospel?
That's, I want to say no. But I think, you're going to pin me in the first 10 minutes of this conversation. So no, I'll say, I think no and yes. And you tell me, Tim, your reflections on my answer. My personal view, what I've come to. So I think, let me back up and just say, as I answer your question, that I actually don't think that there is a content of saving faith. I don't think there's a set of propositions. Okay. If we go down that road and we say that there is a set of propositions, then, well, to your point, that would mean that you kind of would have a different gospel, except if it turns out that what the gospel just is believing in Jesus, then I have no problem thinking that if someone believes that Jesus died on the cross for their sins and that they believe in him for everlasting life, and they believe that everyone who believes in Jesus for everlasting life has everlasting life, they believe all those propositions to be true. Now, I guess in the strictest sense of the word, if they are trusting those propositions to save them, well, then they don't believe the gospel. But I don't really think, Tim, that most people believe at the end of the day those propositions. That what actually happens in reality is, in affirming those propositions, they put their faith in the person of Jesus. So I would say that they end up believing the gospel in spite of the argument rather than because of the argument.
That's fair. I'm with you. I want to say no, it's not a different gospel. And like, I would come from a different, I like where you're going. I would come from a different angle and say, like, most of the controversies of this type, no one actually disagrees about the facts of the case.
Right.
Right. We all
Yeah.
believe.
So, and let's just say that very clearly. Everyone in this debate believes that they believe Jesus is God. They believe Jesus is the Son of God. The deity. They believe that he's the Christ. They believe in everlasting life. They believe that Jesus is the only way to be saved. They all believe that faith alone in Christ alone is how you're saved. They all believe all those in death, burial, resurrection. They believe all the same facts.
We all believe in all of those things. The question over which we're anathematizing people is exactly how cheap can I be with my unbelieving friends?
Right.
Like, I've got this sack full of things about Jesus.
Right.
And we all agree that if I just dump the sack and they swallow all of it, they're saved.
Right.
The argument is over which things could I not dump and they would still be saved. And the practical answer here, like, no, it's not a different gospel. Just tell the whole, just dump the sack and quit worrying about it.
Right. Right. But it's worth noting that, and I guess, let me just say a name, because anybody who's watched this video, or they can look, they either know the names already or they can look them up. As far as I understand the history, and I was there for 20 years ago when it first started, I didn't realize it was starting at the time. But basically what happens is Zane Hodges with GES starts asking the question, as far as I recall, the question was, does a man have to believe in the resurrection in order to be saved? Or does the resurrection of Jesus motivate him to be saved? And his basic argument was that the disciples clearly believed in Jesus before the resurrection, and they had everlasting life. John 6:47, whoever believes in me has everlasting life. That did not include the resurrection for them. His argument is that there's nothing in the Gospel of John that changes, that says now you have to believe in the resurrection, so we're saved the same way the disciples are, so you don't have to believe in the resurrection of Jesus. So then that creates this whole argument. Well, wait, do you have to believe in the resurrection or not? Is it a motivation? Is it a necessary fact? What are the necessary facts to be believed? And then you have Romans debate, and you have the 1 Corinthians 15, and you have the Gospel of John, and that's where the argument kind of started and has been growing for, again, a couple of decades now.
Yes, and much jockeying for position about whose favorite passage is going to hold sway.
And so to your point, then the question becomes, if we accept the idea that, so if we, and everybody ends up somewhere, I don't know where this part happens, somewhere along the line, everybody accepts the idea that what faith is persuasion that some proposition is true. Well, then the question naturally becomes, then what propositions do I have to believe
what's the proposition?
so that I can say that I, well, and then the standard GES answer has become, you believe that Jesus gives everlasting life to everyone who believes in him for it. That's kind of way that they have come to formulate it. If you believe that Jesus gives everlasting life to everyone who believes in him for it, then you believe the gospel and necessarily you have everlasting life. And I will refer viewers back to the conversation you and I had on whether or not assurance is the essence of saving faith.
Yeah.
And so that's a proposition. And so the question is, if it's not that proposition, the question becomes, is that proposition sufficient, or are there other necessary propositions? And if you say there are other necessary propositions, then if someone only believes GES's proposition, do they believe the gospel? That's why this becomes so nasty. Have I put that fairly?
I mean, I think so, but like on this issue, fairness is not the word that springs to everyone's mind when they think of me. So I have been known to be a little spiky about it. So speaking of spiky, like earlier this week, you posted something that that was the impetus for this conversation. That is what I wanted to ask you about. Okay. So you're approaching the content of saving faith controversy sort of like through the back window, with a very different take on it. And you were like, and consciously, like, you've been around long enough, you are drawing battle lines and creating some controversy here in service of, moving the conversation forward. But walk us through this. What did you say, and why now, and why, and like that?
Sure. Well, I know the particular conversation. Let me back up just a bit and tell you kind of the building. Of course, I've been thinking again about this for 20 years, and I've been on both sides of the debate. There was a time when I fully embraced the GES view, and then there was a time, well, maybe the more classical FGAs. I've kind of been trying to figure it out where it was myself. And so a few weeks ago, and I won't say name at this point, but there was a conversation that on a discussion board that you and I are both on, and I was reading about a debate between a free grace person and one of their professors over this, what I took to be this very issue. And I objected in that original conversation. I argued that I don't think that faith being viewed as a proposition is even the right idea. I don't think that I think the notion of the content of saving faith is a misnomer from the get-go. And I think it's a misnomer because, Tim, I don't think that faith is belief in a proposition. I just think that's the wrong way to view faith. The nature of faith is not being persuaded that a proposition is true. And so what I tried to do is I gave several examples in the Bible where the word faith is used and it cannot be translated persuasion. It just can't reasonably. So my favorite example is John 2:2, where it says that many believed in Jesus, but he would not. And then the text is something like believe in those people, because he knew. Well, if you take the idea of persuaded, well, many were persuaded in him or by him. The first part makes sense, but he was not persuaded by them because he knew it was in their heart. That just, to me, was one of many places that it just doesn't make sense. Paul talks about having the gospel entrusted to him. That word entrusted him is the same word. It's pisteuo, right? It's pistis. And so what does it mean that the gospel was persuaded unto him? It just doesn't make sense. And so my argument then was that fundamentally, at least within the semantic domain of the word, is that faith, it can't only mean mere persuasion. It also has within its maybe it does sometimes, and I'd like, actually, you tell me if you think it ever does. It maybe means mere persuasion sometimes. I think Romans 4 it might, but then other times it means something like to entrust yourself to or entrust something to. And when you're entrusting someone or something, that's not believing a set of propositions. So before I go any further, that was where this started for me, the conversation we're having now, a couple weeks back. So your thoughts on that so far?
Okay. Well, I'd have to honestly would have to like you, my view has gone through a few iterations on this
Sure.
over the last couple of decades. And I would have to go back and see if I feel like I have a couple of slam dunk examples of where persuasion of a proposition is clearly what's in view.
Yeah.
I think it's likely that we'll find some, but I don't, and Romans 4 would be a good place to look actually, but I don't have
Right.
what I would consider a slam dunk example just
But
off the top of my
sure.
head.
So, but at a bare minimum, what we would say is that at least the fundamental idea of pisteuo, or it can't always mean mere persuasion for sure, or persuasion for sure. It very often carries the connotation of entrusting something to or relying upon something. And that's true both in the Greek word pisteuo and the Hebrew word aman. And so when Abraham believes on the Lord, again, there's this idea in Genesis 15:6 that he was merely persuaded that God was going to do what he says. But if you look at that word aman, my reading of that is actually that Abraham is relying on God's promise to do what he had promised that he would actually do. He thinks that Yahweh not only is capable of, but actually will. He's reliable. In Second Kings, I forget the chapter, I could find it later. The pillars of the temple are called aman, the same word for faith. They're called reliable. So the word aman in the Old Testament means to declare something reliable or steadfast. That's what it means. The word pisteuo translates aman. And so if I'm believing on Jesus, I'm declaring him reliable. I'm declaring him steadfast. I'm entrusting myself to him. I'm relying on him. So to me, that's the essence of what the nature of faith is. So if that's the nature of faith, propositions may enter into that in some way, but I'm not being persuaded that a set of propositions is true.
Or, and correct me if I'm not, if you would object to this, but, or having been persuaded that a particular set of propositions is true, you then come to rely.
Sure. Right. And so I would distinguish, the short answer is yes. And this is where I keep telling people that propositions are necessary and useful insofar as what they do is they let you know who and what you're relying on. And this is really not as mystical as it might sound. We do this all the time. I trust that my boss is going to give me a paycheck, right? Well, okay, I can convey that propositionally, and the fact that I make that reliance go to work I was promised certain things in propositional form. And I believe that my boss told the truth, right? But having believed that my boss told the truth, that I was going to go to, it still remains that I'm trusting that they're reliable, that they're going to keep that they're going to do that, right? And so the propositions get me to, they let me know the person that I'm relying in or declaring steadfast or reliable. But in the end, what it actually is it's the act of reliance itself. Something like that, I think, is another way to put it.
And that situation is amenable to resort to propositions, right? Because you have a contract, all that. But there are other situations that are much more immediate that,
right?
There's no exchange of propositions happening.
Right.
An example comes to mind. When I was in occupational school, I was like tail end of a class break trying to sign up for some lab time. I run into the lab, I sign up, and I turn around and I'm like, I'm late. I'm going at pretty close to from a standing start to a dead sprint to get back into the classroom. And I just plowed into one of my fellow students.
Oh, yeah.
And caught her and was able to get her like back up on her feet, like didn't knock her over, caught her.
Mhm.
And there was a moment of like where her body was just locked in panic.
Yeah.
And I just held on to her,
Hmm.
and then she relaxed
Hmm.
and kind of came back. And there was a moment where she moved from I'm falling to I'm not falling. I can rely on this.
Yep.
And there were no words.
Correct. And
Nothing was said.
and it's also precognitional. And this is something we know about the way that the
Yes.
human brain works. Your brain actually, and I mean your brain, actually will make a split-second decision before you cognate, before we know that we can trace them, like the paths in the brain. And your brain will make a
Yep.
snap judgment and say this is a reliable bit of information or not, and you'll rely on something before you before you have cognitively made the intellectual agreement or assent to that.
Yes. Yeah. The intellection comes later, and some of the really dumb things we do happen in hindsight
Right.
because that initial mechanism was
Right.
fooled. We're just
Yep.
poorly equipped for that particular decision.
And I think that anybody who's done any kind of mental health, including good, deep pastoral work, and I, again, with all due respect to my pastoral, I don't mean preachers. I mean people who've sat with people and listened to their stories. What they will all understand is that, uh, how obvious is this when I say it out loud? You don't know why you do half the things that you do. This is why pastoral conversations work, is because why did I do that? And you have to work hard to get under those things, right? And you realize that underneath all of your beliefs, there is now, having gotten way down under there to find not just one motivation, but contradictory motivations that are driving you, right? At some point, you realize a large part of the work you're doing is learning how to put those beliefs in propositional form so that you have some rational ability to respond to them and mold them, so you can
Mhm.
use the rational intellectual process to direct your faith. That's a good
Yes.
thing, but that doesn't mean that faith is fundamentally a cognitive intellectual process. So it
Yeah.
is deeper than that. So again, I know that plenty of my friends in the gray circles get frustrated with me, but everything you say, I can put in propositional form. Well, of course, that's because you've already figured it out. But the act of faith itself is deeper than that. I think, in fact, at bottom, every act of faith is at bottom non-cognitional. At bottom, it's given all these cognitive facts, and maybe some that I'm not totally, I'm just going to rely. I'm going to trust. I'm just going to go with that. That's what faith is. I'm
Mhm.
going, yep. All right. You know what? I have enough information. So, and this is where I think the testimonies becomes a great illustration. The scriptures, we know who Jesus says he is. We have the resurrection. We have God's testimony. And in personal life, I've got my parents' testimony and what my pastor says, what God's done. Now, listen, I'm not Paul. I've not had a road to Damascus. Like Jesus himself has not appeared to me in glory, right? I have enough information to believe what he says about himself or not. But I have to choose at some point to I'm just going to trust that. And that's not mere persuasion. That's just not. It's, there are propositions that I'm persuaded by, but that's not what it merely is, right?
Yeah. And well, I mean, you know where I'm coming from here. Like it is trust in a person.
Yep.
Like the whole point of all of this of salvation by grace through faith, God's chosen mechanism for salvation, is precisely that you rely upon Jesus for your salvation.
That's exactly
um,
right.
Jesus will save you in spite of your works, not
Right.
because of them, in spite of your theology, not because of it,
Right.
in spite of everything. Jesus
Right.
will save you if you're trusting him in spite of everything, then you're there.
Yeah.
And if
Yep.
you're not, then it doesn't matter what you're trusting. It's not the right
That's
thing.
exactly right. So you just trust him as best you know how. So that was that first post that I made, to still trying to answer the question you asked a
Yeah,
minute
yeah.
ago. So then the follow-up post about, I guess it was about a week later, is the one that specifically you were responding to and we were asking about. This is where I decided to really kick the hornet's nest, because I've already got people mad at me because I'm challenging the definition of faith as mere persuasion. I don't think that's an appropriate definition of faith. Then I went on and I argued that I think that the whole, given what I've said about the definition of faith, I think the content of saving faith argument is not only wrong-headed, because saving faith doesn't have content at all. It has an object. This is my point. Saving faith doesn't have content. There's not a list of propositions. It has an object. If we accept, Tim, the premise that saving faith has content, the natural question becomes, and you this earlier, is what are those list of propositions? Which ones make the list? Which ones don't make the list? And that becomes the 20-year argument that we have. And I am seeing here a very serious problem in the distinction between evangelism and discipleship. And one of the reasons that I reject lordship salvation is because I think that it seriously confuses evangelism and discipleship. Lordship salvation takes a discipleship issue, which is something like my submission to the lordship of Jesus Christ, and that turns that into an evangelistic endeavor. If I really want to be saved, I have to do the disciple thing, rather than recognizing that I'm calling unbelievers to become believers, to put their faith in Christ, and then I'm calling the believers to trust Christ enough to obey him and to follow his lordship. So I think that lordship is a discipleship issue. It's not an evangelism issue. If in the gray circles we all accept that, I think that the content of saving faith has become the same thing, because this work of trying to decide which propositions are necessary, first of all, I don't think you can find that list, because maybe you and I can discuss that. I don't think there is a list anywhere of what they are. That work is at best a very difficult work of systematic theology. And the work of working through a complicated systematic theology is, to me, clearly a matter of discipleship. My 5-year-old does not understand. My 14-year-old doesn't understand all this stuff. She's learning her discipleship. And so to make a matter of systematic theology that you have to work through to become evangelism, just is getting people to learn this theological rule, reduces evangelism to passing a theology test, and passing a theology test is something that disciples do. So what we've ironically done in our free grace circles is we've gone right back to lordship salvation on another form, which is that we have found another way to turn evangelism into discipleship, or discipleship into evangelism.
Yep. Yeah. Only this time, instead of don't drink, don't smoke, don't whatever, it's past the soteriology exam.
Exactly. And so, and just like I say to my lordship friends, listen, I'm not saying that you should go drink and smoke and God. Clearly, we should live our lives physically holy, right? In just the same way, we should do the hard theological work of trying to figure out what's true. So you and I both understand that we should do that work, but that can't be what the gospel is, because the gospel is about relying on Jesus, not figuring out the theology of how the gospel works. The gospel is the story of Jesus, and that's something you can speak to even better than I can. You understand the narrative structure, but then I argued that the gospel is really not presented as a list of propositions. The gospel is presented in a narrative. There's a reason, and I stole this from you years ago, and you said this to me a couple of years ago, and I've taken it since then. God could have saved us by giving on Mount Sinai, but instead he became a human. He incarnated, right? He didn't save us by giving us a list of commandments to follow. He became a man. He entered into history with us. And so the gospel is a story where I'm relating to the narrative. Well, okay, naturally narratives and stories are told in propositional form. So again, I'm not denying that you need propositions from a practical perspective to understand who this Jesus is. But the point is not to believe the propositions as a set of things that I'm believing to be saved. It's these propositions create a narrative, and the narrative is how I relate, and I get pointed to this person in whom I'm believing. And I don't think that that's particularly theological or especially mystical. We do this all the time. My friendship with you, Tim, is really a narrative at some level, right? It's the story that you and I have had together.
And it's irreducibly personal. It can't quite be reduced to I am persuaded of these things about Chris and Chris is persuaded of these things about me. There are certainly things we're persuaded of
Right.
about one another, but that does not really adequately describe the situation.
Yeah. If I were to try to reduce our friendship to a list of propositions on paper, that is plainly absurd. Just as much as if I were to take my wife, my marriage to my wife, my relationship to Gretchen, and just list exhaustively every fact I know about her does that constitute my relationship? If I say yes, there's something wrong with my marriage.
Yeah. Yeah, which problem you're having depends on whether, like, when you say yes, whether it's true or whether you're that deluded. Those are two very different problems, but they're both big problems.
Right.
You know?
So now, but clearly I can say lots of things about my wife, and clearly through, for example, the dating process, learning things about her in propositional form was necessary to build my relationship with her. But I think critically, building my relationship with her and you and any human being, including Jesus and including any person, including God, is not reducible to adding to a set of facts about her. In fact, some of the most, as we've all had, some of the most important moments I've had where I deepen my relationship with her have been decidedly non-propositional. It's not been a fact I've learned, it's time invested. And I have to get a bit, how do you get poetic here? Because sometimes poetry is the only way to capture what's going on, right? It's the union of the souls, and there's knowledge in the union of the souls.
Well, yeah, and there's solid biblical precedent for this before we go there. When you reduce it to that list of propositions, like, there's a certain class of human that thinks of themselves as drawing close to another person because they're just acquiring more things on their list. We call this a stalker. There's a word for that. Like, I've
Wow,
got
but
this
yeah.
exhaustive list of things about Jodie Foster or whoever. I know her better than she knows herself. Look at my list. Well, no, that's not actually knowledge of the person.
Right.
That's something, and you should get help. But it's not
Yeah.
knowledge of the person. And that union of souls, the sharing of experience, the actual being together, is something beyond just an exchange of propositions, which is why the first time the word know shows up in the Bible is Adam knew his wife and she
Right.
conceived and bore a son. He wasn't just slipping her a proposition.
Yep.
That's not how this works.
Well, and anybody who's done any work in Greek or in Spanish or Latin-based languages know this is also a uniquely English problem. We use the word know to refer to both an awareness of facts and also an experiential understanding of, but a lot of languages distinguish between those words. So in Spanish, and again, maybe my pronunciation is wrong, but like conocer versus saber. One of those, I think it's, I don't know which one is which. I think it's the saber, I think, is awareness of facts, and conocer
Conozco is a person.
yeah. And but again, it's this and again, you have those in Greek, and many languages. And so, but we just kind of reduce, well, I know that person. But at the same time, every preacher in the world has pointed out on more than one occasion there's a difference in knowing God, knowing Jesus, and knowing about Jesus. We all intuitively understand that difference.
Yeah, but the problem is it is intuitive, and it becomes, when you're trying to pin it down, as with a lot of everyday concepts that you're like,
right,
that are standard equipment for humans, when we start going, wait, what exactly are we saying? It's tougher than you would think to articulate.
So there are, and I don't want to do too much philosophy, but I do want to say it is understood among most philosophers. I don't want to say all, because there's nothing all philosophers agree on, but philosophers tend to argue that there are certain basic concepts that literally can't be defined. They are the basis by which we define everything else. And in the classical world, the word substance, you can't actually define. I can give you some characteristics of what substance is, but at the bottom of substance, you know what a substance is. It's the stuff of the world, right? One of those words is knowledge. You can't, so I can give you a philosophical definition of knowledge is justified true belief. And every philosopher is usually will laugh at you and say, have you heard of a Gettier problem? That disproves justified true beliefs. Well, clearly, having beliefs is not enough to have knowledge. Having justified beliefs is because your beliefs have to be true, but having true beliefs isn't enough to have knowledge, but justified. So what happens is it turns out that you can't actually, you can estimate what it means, but at bottom, knowledge is something that's so deep as far as what it means, like the word experience. You can't actually define it. You just refer to it. You know what these things are. And so at some point, if I try to take the word knowledge and define it as persuasion, it's going to leave out things like we're discussing right now. To believe in a person is not to be merely persuaded by a person. And then there are those of us in our theological camps, Tim, who just plant their flag and say, no, it is being persuaded by a person of facts about them. And it doesn't work. They try, and it creates a 20-year debate that can't be solved.
Yeah, I speaking as one of the people who tried valiantly, like it can't be done. It doesn't ultimately work.
It doesn't. And so again, the argument becomes that I think that what's happened is we spent 20 years trying to figure out what the propositions were. And I think with my friends who want to say the death, burial, resurrection are necessary, the classic guys, it's not that they're wrong. The death, burial, resurrection is or is not necessary. It's not that the GES side about the promise is the thing to be believed. It's not that they're wrong. It's the fundamental assumption that what's to be done is to identify a set of propositions. If you make that claim, if you concede that what we're doing is identifying the minimal set of propositions, that's where the mistake is. C.S. Lewis once said that if you make a wrong turn, the quickest way to get back on track is to go back. And so we have to go back to that point where the mistake that we made was thinking that faith is identifying this content. And then if I can enumerate the propositions, I'm going to say to you, Tim, you cannot enumerate the propositions because that misunderstands what faith is. There is no content to saving faith. There is an object of saving faith. That object is Jesus. And there's a story around him by which we relate to him. And it's a true story.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you're taking a step back. The battle line you're drawing here,
and it is a battle line. That's right.
Yeah. Well, I mean, unavoidably, there's already a battle. Right. You're joining something, and it's not a party.
Right.
The battle line that you're drawing is between all of the content views.
Yes.
And
all of them.
Something else and an alternative, and the way in which you're going to frame that is that the content views all presuppose something about faith that isn't true.
Correct. That's very well said. Yeah.
So the true thing,
mm-hmm.
Correct me if I'm not tracking you here, is that faith is, like in the context of saving faith here, faith is reliance upon a person.
Mm-hmm.
It is irreducibly personal.
Yep.
And therefore, in an important way, would you use the word precognitive?
Yes, actually, I would. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I have used that in work elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's precognitive.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and I know a bunch of people just went off like Roman candles here, hearing you agree to that. So maybe say a little more about what exactly precognitive means here.
Sure. So I don't want to go, this can get really heavily in the weeds. Precognitive doesn't necessarily mean that, again, that there's no cognitive information at all. Go back to what I was talking about human behavior earlier. I can use my cognitive processes, and in fact, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, works on this whole, and it does work. It works on this whole premise, which is that I can identify beliefs that I have that I don't realize that I have. Once I identify them, I can work to change the beliefs. And what those the beliefs do is they have a precognitive impact. And so an example of a precognitive, this is very basic. If I'm out here in Florida, I'm outside walking, and all of a sudden I hear and I look down and I see a rattlesnake, I promise you, before I have any realization, like before I have actually cognitively been aware that I'm looking at a rattlesnake, I have already had a reflexive action where I've jumped back. And I have had a physical sensation. My heart's racing. It's fear, right? And you can do that with almost all the emotions. So, literally all the emotions, actually. And so precognitive just means that this is something that your body, your mind, your soul has reacted to before it goes necessarily, the keyword is necessarily, through the intellective process. Now, again, I can use intellective process to build a precognitive function and that I work from. And in fact, this is why people who are really, I play guitar. My daughter's learning how to play the guitar. I don't have to sit around and think about how to find the next chord because I've done it for 20 years. Where that chord is, we call it muscle memory. That's precognitive. There was a time when it was highly cognitive, right?
Right.
So given all that long background, so faith being precognitive means that there is a capacity that I have as a human being to trust something. Now, I may trust something given a set of cognitive facts that I've developed, but there's also a lot of things that I trust that I have never once thought about. Babies don't have a cognitive facility when they trust their parents, and they are trusting their parents. When I drive down the road, I don't sit around. I'm not thinking about I'm not thinking about the red light, whether or not I stop when it's red and I go when it's green. I'm not cognitively I'm just trusting these things. I mean, the amount of stuff, Tim, that I trust every single day precognitively is the vast majority of what I trust. And so I'm not saying, again, that the cognitive aspects don't enter into why I trust, but I'm saying that the act of trust itself is fundamentally precognitive. It's that, all right, I'm at a place, I've heard the story. Now, do I believe it or not? Do I trust it? Do I rely upon it? And that may or may not include the intellective processes.
And we've all had the experience, I think, with a story even, of like buying somebody's story, being halfway into doing whatever it is that the story was designed to move us to do, and suddenly stopping and being like, wait, why am I buying this?
Yeah, like you suddenly realize that you believe this after the fact. Like,
right.
wow.
And
it's something you discover about yourself.
And then oftentimes with those sorts of discoveries, it's like, this person has spun me the most ridiculous cockamamie lie. And as soon as I think of the right question, I'm like, wait a minute.
Right.
But for
Right.
but there was a moment there when I was buying it and I
Right.
was getting ready to write the check. And then I'm like, wait, time out. What?
But here's the other cool thing, Tim. So not only is this trusting element, this trusting element that we have, this act of faith that this power of faith that we have precognitive, and it can be influenced by our cognition, but it's precognitive. It's also post-volitional. And what I mean by that is the will. Like I can realize that I've trusted something and I can choose to stop trusting it. I can also choose to trust something that I have doubts about. So whereas I think this is important, I cannot, and this is a debate that we have again in free grace circles, I can't choose to believe that 2 + 2 is 5. No matter how hard I try, I can't choose to believe that, right? There's a sense in which it's true that you can't choose to be persuaded by something. I can't choose to believe that George Washington is the president of the United States. I don't believe that. You can't convince me of that. I can choose to trust people. I can make the choice to trust you. Now, I can have, and in fact, there can be good evidence of why I can't trust you, and I can do it anyway. And when I do, because of other beliefs that I have that I'm persuaded that I can't change, I'm going to have precognitive fear and emotions. And don't trust him. Don't trust him. And I'm going to feel that fear. In fact, I think this is of pastoral importance. We tell people to trust God, and they are scared to death. They're terrified to trust God. And we're asking them to do it anyway. That's faith.
Yes.
And so it's precognitive, and it's post-volitional. And so it's not merely an act of the will, because hopefully you get to the point that you're believing God and trusting him before your will is even involved. But you can also will yourself to just trust God.
Your will can do something, but it can't do everything.
Correct.
Is which again, slippery, makes it difficult. Can't make yourself believe that 2 plus, and there's like, this is in our language. When we talk about make believe,
yeah,
that's a synonym for pretend.
Yes.
Right. You can't just make yourself believe something at a certain, beyond a certain threshold. But you can choose to trust in the teeth of doubts.
Yes.
Well, we see this in the New Testament. The guy who brings his son to Jesus, and Jesus says all things are possible for those who believe. And the guy says, I love this. It's one of my favorite passages in the Bible. Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief.
And doesn't that suddenly make a whole lot more sense? It's suddenly, I think it's very natural and intuitive. And we just need a model of faith that accounts for that very natural experience of it. I do believe, but I have doubts. I'm going to trust you anyway. Help my struggle trusting you. And that's natural. We all live with that.
And worth noticing, this is Jesus does not go, my man, that's not faith. Get out of here.
Right.
He heals his son.
He does, because he's honoring the fact that the man, in fact, did the thing. The thing that he did was he chose to trust. And again, I would invite my free grace friends who are on the persuasion view. What would it mean to be, Lord, I'm persuaded? Help the fact that I'm not persuaded. That's not mysterious. That's just contradictory.
You have to be like a Bible college freshman sitting particularly late at night talking about these things to start to think that that's deep.
So, and again, I won't go any further, but just to throw some language out there, again, philosophical language, if you go back to, I'm an Aristotelian. And so if you buy an Aristotelian theory of the soul, he holds what are called a faculty view of the soul, where your soul has powers. Among the powers of the soul, there's an intellective power. And this is where you're persuaded of beliefs. You can't actually make yourself believe anything. It's the pretending thing. You have a volitional power, which is the will. I can elect this good for the will is the elective power. There are other powers the soul has. There's the imaginative power. There's the power to remember. There's all these powers the soul has. What I'm basically suggesting is that there's a power that what it does is trust. And what it basically does is if I was going to invent a technical language, I would say that the pistive power, if I can, and I'm making this up, okay? That's the Greek word. That what it does is it makes an assessment, and it takes that assessment of reliability. This thing is reliable or it's not, and then it passes that assessment on to the intellect and the will, and then the will chooses whether or not, and the will can direct that assessment. The will can't direct beliefs, but the will can direct the assessing power. So that's kind of the technical model that I have. Now, you don't have to believe all that. That's just an example of how you might work out the underlying notion. You can also just ignore all of that and just say, look, the fact of the matter is, experientially, I can't choose my beliefs. Experientially, I can choose to believe. So I can choose to do certain things. And experientially, I can choose to trust something. And that kind of gets at the same idea.
Okay, so for the folks who are not going to look under the hood because they don't want to know.
Sure.
Fair enough. Well, and it would seem that a lot of the people in the biblical story are not looking deeply under the hood.
No.
They're just trusting in Jesus.
Most people, almost everybody. It's the work of theologians and philosophers who do that kind of work. And since when do we really need that kind of theology and philosophy? It's interesting and it might be helpful, but it's not necessary.
Yeah. Well, and again, going back to your earlier thing, that's taking the work of discipleship and you don't want to load that into evangelism.
I would certainly hope not. And even if the other thing is, even if someone hears that, well, Chris, I don't accept that philosophical breakdown for these reasons. I am a philosopher. This person says to me, and I reject your model because of these reasons. Well, that's fine, but can you at least recognize that if you reject my philosophical construct, it's because you have a different philosophical construct than I do? Are you really about to tell me that faith in Jesus is dependent on accepting a particular philosophical construct? That's nuts. So now there's a certain philosophy that's necessary in order to believe the gospel. I just don't. My kids have no such philosophy.
Which was not articulated until, hundreds of years after
No.
the
So
New
again,
Testament was written.
these are perfectly fine things, again, theologians can do and philosophers can do to help clarify. For those of us who are interested in, and if somebody's watching this video this time, this far in, they're clearly interested in this kind of stuff, then do this kind of work because it's helpful and interesting and helps you understand the debate. But don't make this stuff, don't bring all this stuff, don't bring any of this into evangelism. Evangelism is very easy. And we know because we've all been doing it.
Yeah.
For
Point
our
people
whole
to
lives.
Jesus.
Yeah, that's just all that you do.
Yeah, there's a way in which, if you let this get into your evangelism, you turn it into, this is me snapping a selfie of myself having faith in Jesus.
Yeah.
Rather than me looking at Jesus.
Right.
Faith is me looking at Jesus. Faith is not me snapping a selfie of myself. Look at me with Jesus.
Right. Well, again, silly example. If I can take the self example a step further, it's similar to, it's like the difference in going to a concert and enjoying the band versus going to, let me use it here in Florida. So going to the beach and then watching the sunset versus going to the beach and getting my cell phone and recording the sunset and I'm looking at my screen. And I've actually had that experience of myself looking at the screen rather than the actual sunset. I've had that experience of myself doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not faith. This is theology. My job, how's this for the pun? My job is to look at the sun.
Very nice. Well done. Dads everywhere are proud.
I knew I'd finally get one you like one of these days. The good poetry and the good turn of phrases, that's your thing, Tim.
Okay, so if we have beaten the philosophy and the theology to death, I'd like to talk a little bit about the social dynamics here, because this is actually pretty important.
Yeah, I think so.
We are having the fight that we're having, not just because the ideas are the way that they are, but because people are the way that they are and interact in certain specific ways. And you had some interesting things to say earlier about how, in that conversation that sparked all this, about how a leader with it may not even be a new idea, but a leader with a compelling idea, then how that kind of shakes out among the followers as you get a few decades in.
Yeah.
And there's predictable patterns to this. And we'll talk a little bit about that.
So let's start just again recognizing what has happened historically over the past 20 years. And the point is going to be that what has happened in the last 20 years within the free grace groups is entirely predictable. You have certain groups that have sprung up around their favorite leaders. And so, we've already mentioned that you have the GES approach, you have the FGA approach, and you have, the Rosker group, the Duluth Bible. And I'm not being a jerk naming all these groups. This is just anybody who's been around this knows. And if you're in the Discord world and the YouTube world, you can list other names as well. And I will say quickly, this is clearly something the first church faced, 1 Corinthians 1-3. One of these days, Tim, I just want to have a conversation with you just about 1 Corinthians 1-3, because we all in Free Grace love chapter 3 because of the Bema Seat of Christ stuff, but there's the chapter 1 and 2 context to that. I think the unit's important. And so this is what we do. Historically speaking, what happens is that someone comes along, and I lay at the feet of tribalism. What we all tend to do is we have in the intellectual world, but also the political world and everything else, someone comes along and they have this idea. They have this new idea, and the founder of an idea comes along and they rally a bunch of followers. And at first, everybody is excited about this idea because the idea itself is defined by its opposition to everything else. It's the new idea. And again, you can see that in again, my philosophy studies, Descartes with his methodological skepticism, or Husserl with his phenomenology, or for that matter, Plato and Aristotle with their particular forms of what it means, the notion of form versus matter. They come up with these new ideas, right? Well, then this particular leader works these ideas out historically, and everybody, that's the guy. And then that guy dies, or he gets old and he stops writing. And then there becomes an argument among his followers. And it's always his followers, with almost no exception to this, who start working out the logical implications, because you don't want to do this, for the most part, not the most contentious stuff, while the leader's still alive, or while the leader's still the big influencer. Because first of all, if you try to take his view too far, then the leader himself is going to exclude you from the movement, right? But then the other thing is, if this is the idea, and then I start taking it way over here, and now the thing is moved. If I start trying, I don't want to exclude you anymore. I don't want to exclude the leader, because now I'm no longer the true heir, right? And so what happens is, historically, you end up having different disciples go different ways. They all try to say they're the true heir, the true inheritor of the tradition, and they start arguing with each other. And this has happened politically. It happened with Marxism. It happened with different interpretations of capitalism. Again, it happened with Cartesianism, what Descartes was. It happened in my personal area of industrial phenomenology. I like Thomas Aquinas. There are at least 7 different schools of Thomism. Anybody who's done church history can look at the breaks in their particular denominational structure and how that happens. This just happens over and over and over again. And I think that's exactly what's happened in the free grace movement. And I don't think Zane is not the leader I have in mind, by the way. The guy who I think the leaders is, I go back to guys like Louis Schaeffer Schaeffer at Dallas. Now, there are some others, but I think that's the founding leaders. And then guys like Zane come out of that. And I think then you start have branches from there, and people are claiming we're the true free gracers. And as things, it's just tribalism. They move further and further and further away, and they start anathematizing each other, even though a modern GES style free gracer has more in common with a classic free gracer than either one of them are going to have with John MacArthur. Your GES guys will anathematize FGA guys just as harshly, if not more harshly, than they will a MacArthurite these days. Because at this point, it's who is the true heir of the tradition. And my point is just that's what happens all the time in history.
Okay, so this is predictable as sunrise. It's how humans work. It's completely natural. The only problem that we face with that as Christians is that we are not called to be completely natural.
Right. Right. So we can just kind of like give in and say, oh, this is going to happen. Or we can say, wait a minute, but as Christians, should this happen? What would be the Christian response to this thing? It's probably rooted in sin.
Okay, so what we're going to want to say is this is a natural thing that happens, which means it is a temptation.
Yeah, that's a better way to put it.
So then, faced with the temptation, what is the right response?
So you've done more in the trenches pastoral ministry than I probably have. I've done it uniquely in the chaplaincy world, but I guess going back to Corinthians, the important thing is there has to be some intentionality in not being tribal. We have to be clear about what the thing is. And I don't know that that's terribly helpful, because what guys today are going to say is, well, I am being clear on what the saving proposition is. Okay, but well, you said, well, Chris, you're giving a battle line, and the battle line is that there is no proposition. And so we have to figure out how to say something like, and this is where history and tradition helps. We were not having the argument 40 years ago, right? We weren't having this argument 40 years. It didn't exist the content of saving faith did not exist 40 years ago, right? And yet 30, 40 years ago, was it 30 years ago in the 80s? You had Ryrie correctly arguing down John MacArthur, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to go back and figure out where things went off track. And we have to get unified around, it's like being a doctor. Where'd you go off track? Where did things start breaking? And then let's go back to what worked. Let's go back to when you were healthy. It's something like that. And then it's repentance. It's I'm not going to look at you as the enemy. It's something like that. I'm open to how you would approach it, but it's something like that. It's humility, and it's going back to what works.
And going, well, and I would go actually back to straight into 1 Corinthians here. Because the guy that you're thinking about who's going to be like, I am doing the thing.
Mm-hmm.
That guy shows up in 1 Corinthians. We have the I am of Paul and I am of Cephas and I am of Apollos. We got all those groups. And then we have the I am of Christ group.
Yep.
It's like, I just follow Jesus, man. I don't know what these guys are on about.
Yep.
And Paul has something to say to that person, and it's not attaboy.
Right.
Paul's retort to that person is Christ divided?
Right.
If you are following Christ in such a way that all those who belong to Christ belong to you, great. If you're following Christ and, man, it's getting kind of hard to find people in the church like me, as faithful as me anymore, you're doing it wrong.
Right.
Jesus is not divided. Jesus is not stealing from one of my friends here. Jesus is not building himself a harem. He's building himself a bride.
That's beautiful. I love that.
Right. We will be one.
Yeah, and again, the verse that pops in my mind as you're saying that is, Jesus does not say the world will know you're my disciples by your theological your theological purity. He says the world will know you're my disciples by how you love each other. And if I'm willing to exclude someone in this really pious kind of, but this is true, then boy, man, you're playing a dangerous game. You're playing a dangerous game, excluding people. And by the way, if we can maybe go a hair off track to come back, I'd be curious to see your take on this. There are people who are very quick to close the communion table to people. I think closing the communion table, first of all, I don't think we take communion seriously enough, but I think closing the communion table is very, very near a serious sin. To exclude someone from the communion table is in some sense to say you are not a member of the body of Christ.
Oh, that's exactly what it has to mean. And I recognize that most of the people who fence the table that way would not say that. They're telling an alternate story about what exactly it means, having to do with like if you eat at this table, you're effectively joining this church and assenting to all that it stands for, and blah blah blah. I don't know. I don't know that we've ever talked about this. I agree. We don't take communion near seriously enough. I'm a very strong weekly communion guy. Every place that I minister, we have weekly communion. And I had a good friend ask me in connection with one of my ministries, like, how do you fence the table? And I said, we don't.
I don't.
Here's why. It's not my table.
Yeah, see, exactly.
It's not my table. It's Christ's table. The only way I could possibly have the right to fence Christ's table is if he delegated to me the responsibility of fencing it. And he didn't delegate that to anybody. The one place in scripture that it ever talks about examining someone for fitness in partaking of the table, it says, let a man so examine himself.
That's exactly right.
And so my approach to the table is very strongly that like it is important that we equip people to examine themselves.
That's good discipleship, which is
They
why
should know,
conversations like this are useful.
yeah, they
This
should
is good
know what
discipleship.
it is that they're doing.
Mhm.
And it should be built into the liturgy. Like, and it is in my
Right.
down at Centerpoint in my liturgy every week. Like when you come up and you take that bread and you take that cup, you know what you're doing because I just told you. And I'm really loud and really clear about it.
Yeah.
And I have people who don't take communion there for that reason.
Mhm.
And I've had conversations afterwards sometimes, you know, someone will want to talk to me because like you said, this was like, I'm partaking of Christ and then Christ is in me and I don't want another person in me. That sounds very uncomfortable. I don't like that. Like, okay, this is a great conversation to be having because yes, it means all of that.
Yeah, and it does that and more, right? Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm like, I did not respond to that by like, oh no, you didn't understand. Oh no, you got it.
Yep.
This is exactly the thing. Let's talk about who Jesus is.
Yep.
Because that's the answer at that point.
So
But
the reason, go ahead. No, go finish.
yeah, go ahead.
So the reason that I'm raising the communion bit is assuming people can accept that it should not be fenced, and that the table is about inviting people in. That I cannot think of a better biblical picture of fellowship. So I think the antidote to tribalism is highly intentional fellowship. And I mean that in the sense of it's love. And I know that as soon as you say that word, people think, oh, that's cliche and mushy. But there is a biblical, if I can use the phrase, manly sense of what love is. This very robust, muscular sense of to love is an incredibly powerful, intentional, willful thing where it is this act of service, and I am giving of myself and willing your good. Uh, why? Because you belong to Christ.
Yeah, and there's sacrifices like in avoiding the tribalism. There are sacrifices to be made there. There are like, I'm going to go to a place and spend time with people that I wouldn't spend time with. And the reason that I'm doing it is because these people belong to Jesus and therefore they belong to me.
Yep.
And if I don't go, like I can't be everywhere, I can't do everything. But
Sure.
if I'm the sort of person who never goes, then I might believe that unity is permissible, but I don't actually believe that it's important.
Right.
Um,
Absolutely.
so in a particular, like I have a place to be on Sunday morning. I'm not typically running around going to other people's church services. But I do sometimes make a point of meeting with the pastors in town and praying with them. Make a point, like I go out of my way to build ties with people that are not part of that community that I that I eat with every Sunday.
Yep.
On purpose because and it's costly. It takes time, it takes energy. It would be easier and smoother to live my life without it. And that is exactly the kind of sacrifice that we are called to. It's part of what loving one another means.
So I would say there's nothing wrong with the comfortable habit of being with people like yourself. It helps encouragement. But if you limit yourself to that comfortable habit, well, we all immediately understand, can preach a great sermon on why you can't limit yourself to your comfort zone, right? We can immediately do that. But then the problem is, I think, to take this back to the conversation that started all this, we have guys who have this debate for 20 years. They aren't just staying with people who are in their comfort zone because it's comfortable. They're staying with guys who are in their theological comfort zone because they think that those other people aren't in the camp. They have effectively and intentionally excluded them. Yeah, okay, we might see each other on a on a Facebook group, on a YouTube channel, but we're refusing to work with each other. And if you ask me about that guy, I'm going to tell you all the reasons that I can't actually work with him. And we can get real pious. Well, but listen, I don't oppose what they're, yes, you do. You're opposing what they're doing, and you're wishing them, you get what I'm saying? I want to say wishing.
Yes.
You get what I'm saying?
Yeah. The world would be a better place if they just
If they weren't
disappeared. But I'm not opposed to what they're doing.
Right. Exactly. I'm the Levite who's going to walk by and watch them bleeding out on the side of the road.
I'm going to ignore them to death.
Yes. And I think that's the solution is I want to say this completely sincerely, since I have so strongly drawn the battle line against the content of safe and faith idea, as if there's a set of propositions. If there's somebody listening to this, and I have friends of mine who believe strongly that there are propositions, they still think that.
Same here.
I am, Tim, personally, I fellowship with those people on purpose. I do. Now, I think that they're wrong, but I fellowship with them on purpose. But I also fellowship with people who have different views on me on the millennial kingdom, and different views than I do on baptism. I have really good friends who sprinkle their babies. I'm not a sprinkler, man, but I'm not going to not fellowship with them over that. And I know people who won't, and I think that's wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. If they belong to, this is straight out of Galatians. If they belong to Jesus, they're as clean as it gets. There is no secondary criteria for who we can eat with. And like, and it really might get as nitty gritty as which picnic table you sit at the potluck. Like you can be in trouble with Jesus for which picnic table you sit at the potluck, because Barnabas and Peter were.
That's right. And anybody who's ever done youth ministry work with teenagers with the cliques, they know that because they've had that conversation with their teenagers.
Yeah. And like, do you have the freedom to sit at any table? Yeah, you do. But you, my friend, you're doing it wrong.
Yep. And I know there are people who are irritated because, like, no, we have to, the obvious objection is, yeah, but unity has to be built on truth, which is a wonderfully pious thing to say.
And it's built on the one who said, I am the truth. They belong to him, therefore they belong to me.
Right. But that's
the truth.
The issue. So I tell people all the time that I think theology there's this wonderful and terrifying truth about theology, which is that it is, of all the disciplines, the most moral of disciplines. You can be a very immoral person and practice theology. And what I mean by that, I'm not talking, when I say morality, I'm not talking about, the standard drinking, smoking, sins of the flesh. I'm talking about you can be dishonest very easily and justify all sorts of nonsense. And you can do that. And God will let you get away with it for a while. But so you can make arguments that are bad arguments, and they can be clever. People are clever. And that's all they are, is clever arguments. If you use Jesus's words to contradict Jesus's words, you're not actually learning from him. You are cherry picking what he says because you want to believe something already.
Which brings us to the other piece of the social dynamic, which is, this is not just isolated people. This is tying into the thing you said earlier about the contention for the legacy. And we see this in the New Testament in 2 John. Diotrephes loves to have the preeminence and is running his little church in an exclusionary way where he won't receive brothers from elsewhere and won't, and will kick anybody out of the church who does. And this is a thing that we were already, the ink's not dry on the New Testament, and we already have this problem. And we still have it. This is a thing to look at. And I'm not saying if you get out there and do anything effective, if you write articles, write books, contend earnestly for the faith, minister to the poor, wash people's feet, anything at
Right.
all,
Anything at
sling
all.
hash
Right.
in a soup kitchen. Like if you do anything effective, at some point, someone is going to think you're just the best thing since sliced bread
Mm-hmm.
and is going to get you confused with the Messiah. Like that's a thing that happens.
And you're going to like that feeling. Oh, look, I got noticed. Yeah.
Yes. And the thing to do with that feeling is drag it down into the basement and murder it.
Yeah. Right.
You got to kill that sucker. And if you can manage it, you kill it in the other person too.
Mm-hmm.
Because they should not be confused about, who the mediator between God and man is.
Right.
That this is really important. And what happens is a lot of people go awry in ministry because they go unnoticed for a long time. They're making heroic sacrifices, genuinely heroic sacrifices, doing
Mm-hmm.
great work. It goes unnoticed, and then somebody notices and falls in
Mm.
love with them.
Yep.
And it feels so good to be
Yep.
noticed. And it's so wonderful for someone to finally be grateful for what I've been sacrificing for years, if not decades,
Mm-hmm.
for. And man, if you don't kill that, first there's 1, and then there's 4, and then there's 10, and then there's a whole organization full of them that
And then you're
exist to
building an
promote.
empire for yourself.
Yes. And it's not, and the thing is, like, I heard a particular megachurch pastor once talk about this and gave the best speech I've ever heard on the subject. And the thing that was so striking to me about it that I've never forgotten is he
Mm-hmm.
said, the thing is, like, there are people who set out to do this,
Mm-hmm.
right? Who want people to fall in love with them, who work hard to
Right.
make people fall in love with them so that they can build their empire.
Right.
But this can happen to you without you ever trying to make it happen.
Yep.
And he proceeded to give this wonderful list of things that will have to what it's going to look like from the inside. Like at your church, someone will notice when you show up on Tuesday morning, like which door you come in, and
Mm-hmm.
there will, like, a sign will magically appear on the parking space closest to that door that says reserved for pastor whoever.
Yeah.
And you won't have said anything to anybody about that. And
Mm-hmm.
and he gave a bunch of other examples like that and said, guys, go to the janitor's closet, get a hacksaw and cut that sign down.
Yep.
Do it yourself. Don't ask somebody to do it. You just cut it down. And then you tell them, then you walk in and you go, whose is this? Don't ever do that again.
Right. Right. You have to point people to Jesus. We have to be pointing people to Jesus, which is cliche until it's not cliche.
And that's an affirmative, like, there's a temptation here, and all you can drift into it. You don't even have to try. If you're good at what you're doing and you're serving people and you're helping people, some of them are going to worship you.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're not aggressive about killing it, you will develop a taste for it. And then you become, ultimately, fast forward a bit, you become Diotrephes. You love to have the preeminence. The thing about that is that you and Jesus cannot both have the preeminence. So once you've acquired a taste for you having the preeminence, like once I do that, I'm no longer preaching. I'll say a lot of things about Jesus, but at the end of the day, I'm preaching the glories of Tim.
Yep.
It's
It's the way that I do it.
Tim's will be done, not the Father's will be done.
Right.
It's like, if I give in to that, if I become that, and then somebody comes from outside my group who just doesn't get it,
Mm-hmm.
I'm awesome. I've worked really hard. I've sacrificed a lot, and they just don't get it. And so we, like, sort of shove them, help them to find a place where they will be more at home and can minister effectively. Like, I mean, we can dress this up, right? This is that dishonesty.
Absolutely. Yep.
And again, the beauty of it is I don't even necessarily have to do that.
The group will do it for you.
Somebody's going to do it for me.
Well, and that's the other piece I wanted to bring in, because there may be people who listen to this and they go, well, but I don't do that. But I want to emphasize that you talk about murdering in the other person. If I'm not very serious, so someone compliments me, Chris, Tim, you're the best preacher I've ever heard. Okay, be gracious and take the compliment, but then you have to make sure that that person turns around and gives the glory to Jesus, because if you let that happen, even if I let that happen, even if I choose to, this isn't about me, but if I let that person make it about me, then that person, how many times have we seen it? You will have people start building a tribe around a leader, and then they get defensive, not about themselves, but about the leader. And then you start getting these pecking orders that the group is building around that leader, even though that leader themselves may not be encouraging it. It's not enough not to encourage it. You have to discourage it.
You have to kill that. And it takes work. It takes actual work. I did not realize this until the first time I had a moment in my ministry where it happened to me, and God was very kind to me and made it super obvious. And I had this moment where I had to reevaluate, because I had taken the existence of that kind of person as
Right.
the
As an
evidence that the
affirmation,
leader,
right? Yeah.
evidence that the leader is doing something wrong. Like clearly,
Oh, yeah.
obviously, if this person has fallen in love with this leader, then the
That
leader's
makes
in
sense.
sin. It's a cult of personality. I'm out.
Mhm.
And I looked at this and I realized I didn't do anything wrong for this guy. I did what I should have done for him. It's now my job to shepherd him into the right response to that. He is falling
Right.
for like there's a temptation for him. Nobody's paid attention to him like this. I have. He's falling for me when he should be falling for Jesus. I need to fix that.
Yep.
So it's not necessarily, and I had to learn this lesson the hard way. It's not necessarily evident if you have people like this around you. It's not necessarily evidence that you've done anything wrong.
Right.
But you do have a job to do now. You have an obligation to shepherd them into the right response,
Yep.
because this ain't it.
And again, I think just to generalize that, anybody who's done any mentoring work, I think will intuitively understand what you're talking about. If I mentor, I've mentored, for example, chaplains before. I've trained chaplains. I don't ever let them, and I was very intentional about this, because the way I was trained by my mentor, I don't let them copy me in the way I do it. And I tell them all the time, don't do it the way I do it. You cannot try to copy me. If you try to copy me, the worst thing that I've literally said this to people, the worst that'll happen is you'll get good at doing it the way that I do it. And you'll never learn to provide pastoral care the way that God made you to provide pastoral care. You've got to find how God has called you to do it. And I had a couple of people who really liked the way that I trained them. Like, you cannot do that. That's not what this is about. I think anybody who's done any kind of mentoring will recognize that dynamic about, if a person gets attached to you rather than the thing that you're mentoring them to do, that's a problem. And mentors know that.
Yeah. Well, and the thing I say in I teach one of the bodywork courses I teach is around a particular guy's work. And the thing I tell all of the students is, do not, like, I don't care if you do what he did. In fact, I don't really want you to. I want you to go after what he's going after.
Yeah, exactly. So what's the object? This goes way back to, what is the object of the thing? The object of faith isn't our positions, is Jesus himself. The thing I'm mentoring and training people, but I'm pointing them to Jesus. And then in practice, it's not simply the theology of Jesus. And this is the practical thing that I should be telling people to do, is I'm mentoring people in my view of the grace gospel. Yes, I hope you believe what I believe, because this is the reason I think it. Now, yeah, teach it, believe it, study it, but go out and find somebody on the other side of the argument who disagrees with you, and go work with them. Go love them and work with them. Build a relationship with them too. Because if you're not willing to do that, then this is just another version of that same tribalism.
Yeah, if they belong to Jesus.
So, and again, I know that people just don't want to do that. They go back to, then this is the last thing I'll say, just to reiterate the old point, because then the temptation that comes back up is, well, yeah, but this is the gospel. And you know what, man, there have been people, I was saved in a Lordship Salvation Church. I'm not about to tell somebody at a church that teaches the gospel the way GES does it, that they're not getting a clear gospel. That's just ridiculous. Okay, I disagree with their content as having faith approach. I disagree with the approach. Jesus is being preached there. And if I'm going to sit here in my arrogance and say Jesus is not being preached there because it doesn't align with the way that I think we should approach things, then the problem is with me, not with them. You're muted, by the way. Oh, wait, it actually may be. Oh, nope, yeah, it was you. All right. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Anything else that you wanna add?
I think we covered the territory. So in coming days, what we can look for, hopefully, is more content from you, and I'm happy to help with this too, on articulated, like we're articulating the whole content debate is wrong-headed,
Right.
and we need to rethink this from a different direction. I've been writing in that direction for a while. You've written a number of things, but more content to come. Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah. And again, it should be in written format. It should be in video format, and just, yeah, certainly defend the model, defend the proper view. But I think it's also important to defend the ethos of, and I think that's, again, a good old classic distinction to make. We need to defend what's the ethos, pathos, logos. So the logos, this is the model, the logos, right? The thing that we're doing is the thing that I set up earlier. There's not a COS, there's not a content at all, there's an object. And so that whole view, what is saving faith? Well, then there's the whole, the pathos, which is my values. This is why I'm doing this. And this is because of a whole, they belong to Jesus. And there's the ethos, is how we're doing this. And, so I think all that needs to be a part of the conversation, getting other people involved in the conversation and demonstrating humility and demonstrating unity. I just think that that's something that has to be modeled, Tim.
Amen.
All right. Well, then we'll see where the conversation continues. I appreciate this one. And again, if you guys have made it this far, I really appreciate you. If you've made it this far, dear viewer, I want to invite you to be part of the conversation. Let's see your thoughts. Let us know your contributions as well, and we'll continue the conversation as a community, and then check back, because me and Tim are getting near the end of Hebrews, and we'll do that. We'll do the next chapter probably in the next week or so.
Yeah.
All right. Well, on that note, Tim, thank you as always for the phenomenal conversation. This has been fun. And until the next time I see you, may God richly bless you.